Welcome to Around the House, sponsored by Romac Building Supply. I'm your host, Don Magruder. If you like today's show, go to aroundthehouse.tv to subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our weekly newsletter. In this segment of Around the House, Jimmy Bohanon of Bohannon Associates Land Surveying will be here to discuss the importance of having a land survey done before you buy a piece of property or you do any major improvement on your property. It's very important that when you do a survey, it's by a reputable company that marks your boundaries properly. Land surveying is something that's overlooked many times, and it's very important that it's done correctly. We have a true expert in the studio today, Jimmy Bohanon of Bohanon Land Associates Surveying. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jimmy Bohanon. Jimmy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Don.
Jimmy, before we get started, tell us a little bit about Jimmy Bohanon and Bohanon Associates Land Surveying.
Well, I started land surveying in 1986, fresh out of high school, and I've been doing it ever since. I started Bohanon Associates in 2001.
And what areas do you cover, Jimmy?
We cover Marion County and every county that touches Marion County, which
Okay.
includes Citrus, Levy, Lake, Sumter, some Putnam, but I'm licensed to cover the entire state.
Now, where is your office located?
Our office is located in Bellevue at 5520 Southeast 113th Street.
Let's just start with the basis. Let's go to Surveying 101. How do you survey? What do you do? How can you determine where property lines are? It seems real complicated to me.
Well, if to the person that's not fluent with it, it is kind of complicated. But actually, it's not as bad as it sounds. We start with the legal description of the property. That's basically a roadmap of where the property line should be. And then we retrace the legal description and determine the boundary lines from there.
Now, aren't there permanent, what they call monuments throughout there? Tell us what a monument is and aren't there permanent markers around?
There are multiple types of permanent markers. The section corners where the state has been divided into 1 mile squares, those monuments are 8-inch octagon concrete and they're 4 foot long. There's still a lot of those still around. And then you can have all the way down to a 4-inch by 4-inch by 2 foot concrete monument, or a number 5 rebar that is 18 inches long with a cap on it can be considered a property corner.
Okay. Now, there's different types of surveys.
Yes, there are.
Talk about the types of surveys you do.
Well, we do all aspects of surveying except for hydrographic, not underwater survey.
Okay.
Just don't have my diver's license.
Okay.
So not our forte. But we do boundary surveys, we do mortgage surveys, we do construction surveys, we do residential, we do commercial, we do tree locations, we do topographic surveys.
And talk about that one, because that's very popular now.
Well, the need for a topographic survey is for engineering, so that an engineer can determine where the highs, the lows of the property are, and at what direction that they need to put the flow pipe in order to design the site.
Aren't there also topo surveys very important, because a big issue these days is flood zones?
Yes, it is.
How has surveys been intertwined with determining flood zones and flood insurance? Because that seems to be getting a big focus of yours now.
Absolutely. Just because a property is in a flood zone doesn't necessarily mean it will flood. It's the chance in 100 years that it could flood. Now, some properties will flood every year. So with a topographic survey, we can determine exactly where that flood line is, and if you're building, you have to build outside of the flood zone.
So basically, I understand FEMA, the federal government, has redrawn a lot of flood maps.
Absolutely.
Properties that weren't in the flood zone now are, and you have Wakava basins and you have other runoff springs, and it's very important that you know exactly where your height of your house is going to be. So say you have an acre lot. You're telling me as long as that house is above that flood elevation, you can get by with it.
Absolutely.
How difficult is it to do a topo survey?
It's a little more time consuming because we have to get locations, elevation, and east-west coordinates for north-south, east-west coordinates for each position that we shoot in order to determine the height and lay. And we have to do that sometimes every 10 feet. We may have to do that every 25 feet. And if it's really flat, we can spread it out just a little bit.
And that's also an engineer. I heard a story the other day that someone did a topo survey, and they didn't clean the debris where the land actually was, and they marked it with 2 inches of leaves on top, and it caused a great expense to someone who had to put more dirt in there. Have you heard of stories like that? I guess what I'm trying to drive at, it's very important you hire a reputable, good surveying company, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's taken the time to do it correctly. In this day and age that we're in now, we have a shortage of surveyors in the area. So finding somebody that is experienced, you come across some issues like this. We have several checks and balances to make sure that our guys are trained properly and they know exactly what they're doing.
Okay. Jimmy, if someone had a question about a survey on today's show, how can you be contacted?
You can reach our office at 352-236-2212, or you can email us at contact@bohannonals.com.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the process. If someone needed a survey, first thing they're going to do is give you a call at your office. What happens from there?
At that point, we research the legal description for the property. We'll determine a cost for the survey, and then we contact the customer and let them know that that's what the cost will be. And from there, we go to scheduling and putting the job together.
Okay. And so you can do it over the phone, but how long does it generally take from that phone call to the time they get that survey? How long? What's the type of time period are we talking about?
It all depends on the size of the property.
Okay.
So if it's a bigger project, obviously it will take longer. But an average quarter-acre lot, they're looking 5 to 7 days.
Okay. What should be on a properly marked survey? In other words, someone's called you and asked for a survey. What are you going to mark on that survey, Jimmy?
We're going to mark all the property lines, the property corners, any improvements that are visible, permanent improvements. We're going to note any permanent or above ground utilities. We're going to have a flood statement on the survey, not an elevation certification. It's a flood statement that just says what this property is in. Is it in the flood zone or it's not in the flood zone? We'll also have the proper certifications that the client will need for their closing, lender, title company, whatever it may be that they're using the survey for.
Big deal is well and septic. You know, for example, when you're wanting to if you buy a blank piece of property and you want to put well and septic, you have to locate the well and septic or surroundings and all this type of stuff. Do you provide that type of information?
Absolutely. Every one of our surveys comes out with the well location on there and the septic location and the distance between them.
You're running some issues in some of the spring basins too. That's very important with well and septic, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Dumb question. In a typical real estate transaction, who should request a survey and who should pay for it?
The purchaser of the property should always request a survey, and they're the ones that will be liable for it because that survey stays with them as long as they own the property.
A lot of people who are cash buyers don't want to do a survey. And a survey for a typical average home, it's less than $400, right?
You're between $300 and $400.
So average home's $400, $450 at the most. Okay. Someone's buying a house. They send an old survey. Why should they get a new survey?
Well, you want to make sure that there wasn't any mistakes made. Everybody's human, surveyors are human as well, and it can happen. Doesn't happen very often because we're very regulated on what we can do, how we do what we do. So by following the checks and balances, you should be correct every time. But being human error is a possibility. It is always a chance that there was an issue or something that was a mistake that was made. And it's always better to find out before you purchase the property than afterwards.
Have you ever ran across, I've heard stories that even in some of the new subdivisions, that when another surveyor came out there, the lot was actually in the middle of the road. Have you ever run across situations like that in which the people thought their lot was here, but it was actually there and it was not what it was sold to them as?
Absolutely. It happens, doesn't happen often, but it does happen. I've probably seen that 3 times in the last 2 years.
Really? How are those things remedied?
They change the legal description. We come back in, locate where the road is, where the property should have been, and what the intent of the transaction was when the property was divided.
If someone's been put in a flood zone and they question it, can they appeal the flood zone and through a survey, get a survey and appeal that they have to get flood insurance? Because flood insurance is very expensive.
Absolutely. And the only way to get accurate flood insurance is to have an elevation certificate performed by a licensed land surveyor. And then with that, if the numbers are correct and they fall within the guidelines of FEMA, you can petition FEMA to have a letter of map amendment done, which would change the flood zone for the house.
Now, you're a licensed surveyor, and,
Yes.
and I understand you have all the insurance. If you make a mistake, does your insurance protect the client, or how does that work?
Absolutely. Not only does the insurance protect the client, but as a registered land surveyor, we're liable for our survey as long as we hold a license, personally liable.
One thing a lot of people don't think about is when they're building a house, they don't do a survey to locate the house. In fact, I know in the last couple of years, people built a house and they located and they actually put the home too close to the road within the setbacks and actually put it on someone else's property, and the house had to be torn down. How important, when you're doing an improvement, whether it's a remodel, new home, is to do a survey and have you guys place out the corners?
Well, like with every survey, it's always better to know ahead of time, because if you do the construction and you infringe on a setback, the cost of the survey is way cheaper than having to fix a mistake of that magnitude.
Another area that I'm told you should always get a survey is fence.
Oh, fences make good neighbors as long as they're on your property.
Tell me about fence surveys. How are they generally done, and is it same as a regular full survey, or can you get a simple boundary line fence survey?
We can do a simple boundary line fence survey. It still has to run through all of those statutes in order to follow the proper procedure for doing the survey. We let them know exactly where their property lines are at. We'll even put stakes along the property line so there's no discrepancy about where their property line is.
Now, dumb question. What's your recommendation? You have a property line that's coming down. Should you put it on the property line or an inch or two this side of it?
I always recommend 4 to 6 inches inside your property, just to make sure that there's no issues or infringements.
You've been doing this a long time, surveying.
Yes, sir.
What's the biggest mistake people make?
Not having a survey done and assuming that their property corners and property lines are correct. That's the biggest mistake I find.
And especially for cash buyers.
Absolutely, for cash buyers.
Because cash buyers think they're immune.
Oh, absolutely.
Jimmy Bohannon from Bohannon Associates Land Surveying, thank you for being our guest today. You've given us great information. And be sure to go to aroundthehouse.tv to sign up for our weekly newsletter and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, we will see you around the house.